We're continuing our study of the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1, Freud's Papers on Technique, 1953 to 1954. In this chapter, Discourse Analysis and Ego Analysis, Lacan wishes to challenge psychoanalyst Anna Freud and Melanie Klein's perspective on the ego. Lacan says on page 62, all the recent discussions which take the ego of the analysand, that is, the patient, to be the ally of the analyst in the great analytic work, contain quite obvious contradictions. Lacan thinks these contradictions are apparent in the ego psychology of Anna Freud and Melanie Klein. Lacan continues on page 62 by saying, quote, "It is very difficult to define the ego as an autonomous function while at the same time continuing to regard it as a master of errors, the seat of illusions, the locus of a passion proper to it." End quote. Lacan sees in ego psychology this dual view and wants to contend that if the ego is the site of resistance, if, quote, misunderstanding is precisely its function, end quote, then it doesn't make sense for the analyst to buddy up with the patient's ego. On page 64, Lacan reads a long passage from Anna Freud where she recounts how every time she tried to put into words the symptoms of her patient while in dialogue with her patient, the patient's ego would flare up and she would feel assailed and she would try to lash out at Anna Freud, the patient would. According to Lacan, Anna Freud's mistake was trying to meet her patient ego to ego. According to Lacan, it is at the level of the ego where we operate on what we think we know, but all this is a misunderstanding. So if the patient, or rather if the analyst tries to meet the patient's ego, then she is only pitting one ego against another and never getting to the bottom of the patient's suffering. Lacan puts it this way on page 65. If it is true that our knowledge comes to the rescue of the ignorance of the analysand, it is no less the case that we are also in ignorance, inasmuch as we are ignorant of the symbolic constellation dwelling in the subject's unconscious. End quote. What Lacan means to say here is, so long as the analyst meets the patient ego to ego, the therapeutic work will never uncover what the patient wants deep down. That level of desire is buried in the patient's unconscious, according to Lacan, and has to be revealed. Although Lacan does not come right out and say it, Lacan comes close to saying that the true self of a person just is the person's unconscious. He says on page 66, quote, "The subject of the id, of the unconscious, is a self," end quote. Perhaps it's best to take the cue from Lacan there with the phrasing a self, indicating that we are at our essence a divided subject. Hopefully there will be more to say on this issue in due time. But now we get to a terminological introduction here on page 66 with Lacan's use of the term the real. Lacan says, quote, that the real is what resists symbolization absolutely, end quote. We see in embryo a number of distinctions Lacan will make in this seminar series. He hasn't spelled it out yet, but he will in time come to spell out what we will sometimes call the three registers. So let's spend just a little time looking at the three registers. One register is what Lacan calls the imaginary. This is the world as it appears to us through our senses. But according to Lacan, that world of the senses, the imaginary, is mediated through another register that he calls the symbolic. The symbolic register is that set of everyday rules and systems of meaning that make intelligible the world of the senses. This world is what is expressed in our ordinary language and in our technical scientific language. You can think of language as the exemplary model for what it means to be symbolic. In addition to this imaginary and the symbolic register, which together as a complex we tend to take for our reality, there is what Lacan calls the real. What he says on page 66 is what resists symbolization absolutely. The real is how things are in themselves beyond any sensory experience or symbolic reception, and these are things that we never have conscious access to. Now, Lacan is going to come to say, as has already been hinted at, that most of our suffering comes from unsatisfied desires at the level of the unconscious. This is the register of the real. The question is, how does the analyst gain access to this area of the patient's unconscious to help the patient overcome suffering? We've already hinted at some of these ways. They tend to be in ways in which the human speech patterns are interrupted through slips of the tongue or moments of forgetting. They can also come through dreams, and perhaps there are other avenues as well. Let's go ahead and stop there. Thank you for listening.